Hey guys, ready for another read aloud of our book Old Yeller. And we are on chapter 4 um, in Old Yeller. And it's kind of been a little rough start with Travis and his family, with him wanting to get rid of this dog. But of course, his little brother doesn't, and his mom wants to keep the dog, but Travis does not. And he's done some not so nice things to the dog. And we talked about how this was said a long time ago and things were different then. So make sure you think about that as we're reading this book, that the setting of this book was, quite a long time ago, and things were different then, and people talked different, and did some different things than we would do today. So some of the things that he does to this dog could be considered, definitely it's animal abuse, and what we definitely would consider today animal abuse. But in those times, it was sadly considered normal in some areas. So just know that as we're reading today, all right? A couple of days later, I had another and better reason for wanting to get rid of Old Yeller. That was when the two Longhorn range bulls met at the house and pulled off their big fight. We first heard the bulls while we were eating our dinner of cornbread, roasted venison, and green watercress gathered from below the spring. One bull came from off of a high rocky ridge to the south of the cabin. We could hear his angry rumbling as he moved down the thickets at Catclaw and Scrub Oak. Then he lifted his voice in a wild, brassy blare and set echoes clamoring in the draws and canyons for miles around. "That old bull's talking fight," I told Mama and little Arliss. "He's bragging that he's the biggest and toughest and meanest. He's telling all the other bulls that if they've got a lick of sense, they'll take cover when he's around." Almost before I'd finished talking, we heard the second bull. He was over about the Salt Lick somewhere. His bellowing was just as loud and braggy as the first one's. He was telling the first bull that his fight talk was all bluff. He was saying that he was the he bull of the range, that he was the biggest and the meanest and the toughest. We sat and ate and listened to them. We could tell by their rumblings and bawlings that they were gradually working their way down through the brush toward each other and getting madder by the minute. I always liked to see a fight between bulls or bears or wild boars or almost any wild animal. Now I got so excited that I jumped up from the table and went to the door and stood listening. I'd made up my mind that if the bulls met and started a fight, I was going to see it. There was still plenty of careless weeds and crabgrass that needed hoeing out of the corn, but I guessed I could let them go long enough to see a bullfight. Our cabin stood on a high knoll about 100 yards above the spring. Years ago, Papa had cleared all of the brush and trees from around it, leaving a couple of live oaks near the house for shade. That was so he could get a clear shot at any Comanche or Apache coming to scalp us. And while I stood there at the door, the first bull entered the clearing, right where Papa had one time shot a Comanche off of his horse. He was a leggy, mustard-colored bull with black freckles speckling his jaws and the underside of his belly. He had one great horn set for hooking, while the other hung down just past his jaw like a tallow candle that had drooped in the heat. He was what the Mexicans called chongo, or droop horn. He trotted out a little piece into the clearing, then stopped to drop his head low. He went to snorting and shaking his horns and pawing up the dry dirt with his forefeet. He flung the dirt back over his neck and shoulders in great clouds of dust. I couldn't see the other bull yet, but I could tell by the sound of him that he was close and coming in a trot. I hollered back to Mama and little Arliss. "They're fixing to fight right here where we can all see it." There was a split rail fence around our cabin. I ran out and climbed up and took a seat on the top rail. Mama and little Arliss came and climbed up to sit beside me. Then, from the other side of the clearing came the second bull. He was on the red roan I'd seen at the Salt Licks the day I shot the doe. He wasn't as tall as the long-legged and as the Chongo bull, but every bit as heavy and powerful. And while his horns were shorter, they were both curved right for hooking. Like the first bull, he came blaring out into the clearing, then stopped to snort and slick his wicked horns and paw up clouds of dust. He made it plain that he wanted to fight just as bad as the first bull. About that time, from somewhere behind the cabin came Old Yeller. He charged through the rails, bristled up and roaring almost as loud as the bulls. All their bellowing and snorting and dust pawing sounded like a threat to him. He'd come out to run them away from the house. I hollered at him. "Get back here, you rascal," I shouted. "You're fixing to spoil our show." That stopped him, but he still wasn't satisfied. He kept baying the bulls till I jumped down and picked up a rock. I didn't have to throw it. All I had to do was draw back like I was going to. That sent him flying back into the yard and around the corner of the cabin, yelling like I'd murdered him. That also put little Arliss on the fight. He started screaming at me. He tried to get down where he could pick up a rock, but Mama held him. "Hush now, baby," she said. "Travis isn't going to hurt your dog. He just doesn't want to scare him off the bulls." Well, it took some talking, but she finally got little Arliss's mind off hitting me with a rock. I climbed back up the fence. I told Mama that I was betting on Chongo. She said she was betting her money on Roni because he had 2 fighting horns. We sat there and watched the bulls get ready to fight and talked and laughed and had ourselves a really good time. We never once thought about being in any danger. When we learned different, it was nearly too late. Suddenly, Chongo quit pawing the dirt and flung his tail into the air. "Look out!" I shouted. "Here it comes!" Sure enough, Chongo charged, pounding the hardpan with his feet and roaring his mightiest. And here came Roni to meet him, charging with his head low and his tail high in the air. I let out an excited yell. They met head on with a loud clash of horns and a jar so solid that it seemed like I could feel it clear up the fence. Roni went down. I yelled louder, thinking Chongo was winning. A second later, though, Roni was back on his feet and charging through the cloud of dust through their hooves, and the cloud of dust their hoofs had churned up. Shoot, tongue twister. He caught Chongo broadside. He slammed his sharp horns up to the hilt in the shoulder of the mustard-colored bull. He drove against him so fast and hard that Chongo couldn't wheel away. All he could do was barely keep his feet by giving around. And here they came, straight for our rail fence. "Land sakes!" Mama cried suddenly and leaped from the fence, dragging little Arliss down after her. But I was too excited about the fight. I didn't see the danger at the time. I was still astride the top rail when the struggling bulls crashed through the fence, splintering the post and rails, and toppled me to the ground almost under them. I lunged to my feet, wild with scare, and got knocked flat on my face in the dirt. I sure thought I was goner. The roaring of the bulls was right in my ears. The hot, reeking scent of their blood was in my nose. The bone-crashing weight of the hoofs was stomping on the ground all over me, churning up such a fog of dust that I couldn't see a thing. Then suddenly, Mama had me by the hand and was dragging me from under, yelling in a scared voice, "Run, Travis, run!" Well, she didn't have to keep hollering at me. I was running as fast as I had ever hoped to run. And with her running faster and dragging me along by the hand, we scooted through the open cabin door just about a quick breath before Roni slammed Chongo against it. They hit so hard that the whole cabin shook. I saw great big chunks of dried mud chinking falling from between the logs. There, for a second, I thought Chongo was coming through the door, right on top of us. But, turned broadside like he was too big to be shoved through such a small opening. Then, a second later, he got off Roni's horn somehow and wheeled on him. Here they went, down alongside the cabin wall, roaring and stomping and slamming, their heels against the log. I looked at Mama and little Arliss. Mama's face was as white as a bedsheet. For once, little Arliss was so scared that he couldn't scream. And suddenly, I wasn't scared anymore. I was just plain mad. All right, so we will read the rest of that chapter tomorrow and see what happens after this bullfight. Bye, guys.